So yes, we have different styles. I think we've now established that for sure. I do stupid stuff like having him,
illustrated the point.
Yes.
Rather well.
But now, now this is we'll like, because again, normally we're used to doing this solo, so this is fun to do it together. I'll ask you questions, Hilary.
Okay.
How do you write a novel? Like, do you know how it's going to end?
I was worried you were going to ask me where I get my ideas.
No, I'm not going to ask you where you get your ideas.
Well, I am a seat of the pants writer. I am a failed outliner. When I wrote The Damage Done, I actually wrote an outline for that book. But when I actually started writing, I couldn't follow the outline for more than about 3 or 4 chapters, and I kept veering off. And I made the mistake of thinking, oh, well, it's just something wrong with my outline. I know where this thing is going, and I'll just rewrite part of my outline and it'll all work out. And I got about 3/4 of the way through and then just threw out the outline because it was doing me no good at all. And the thing is, I know the starting point of the book. I have some sense of the ending. I know absolutely nothing in between. And the process of writing the book as a result can be a painful one because I keep changing my mind about things. The one thing that I know really solidly is I know the character. I know the character of Lily really well. I know her history. One of the tough things is that if I script something for her to do, she doesn't necessarily go along with that. And if I force her to, I end up writing myself into dead ends and then having to go back sometimes 5 or 6 chapters and having to rewrite from that point. So it's definitely a seat of the pants kind of experience where I do not know that much about the story. And the only good thing about that is I think that it's maybe because it's surprising for me, some of that surprise is communicated to the reader because it's not as if there are certain things that are clear from the outset of the story. It's all being figured out as I go along. But this is why I do multiple drafts of the book. When I write my first draft, it's completely incoherent, and there is nobody in the world I would ever want to see it. My editor doesn't see it, my agent doesn't see it, my mother and my husband, who read the book first, do not see it. They see it by about draft 3, where I've managed to go back and put something together that's actually coherent. So how about you?
You remind me of, have you guys ever read On Writing by Stephen King? So, okay, when you're a writer, of course, people give you books about writing all the time, constantly. I don't know if this happens in other industries. Like, do people, like, if you're a bus driver, do they always give you books about how to drive a bus? I don't know, but like, I'm always, so like, I can remember getting Stephen King's On Writing, and this would have been like the 40th book about writing I've ever received, like from my grandmother one Christmas. And I'm like, oh, Grandma, thanks a lot, another book about writing. And I'm, kind of getting ready to toss it over on the shelf or something like that. And then I picked it up and I read the foreword, or maybe it was the second foreword of that book. And I'm not going to quote it quite perfectly, but it basically said, most books about writing are, no, he said, this is going to be a short book because most books about writing are filled with bullshit. So I figured the shorter the book, the less bullshit, right? And I'm like, okay, this is my kind of book on writing. And I picked it up, and what he talked about is actually kind of what you do and what I do as well, which is you take believable characters, you take real characters that you feel like you actually know. And in my case, I actually hear in my head. I can close my eyes, I can see them, they talk in my head, I can hear them. You throw them into sticky situations, and then you make them work their way out.
Right.
Yeah, and I very much agree with you. It's like, even if I would force a character to do something that they don't want to do, it doesn't work.
Yeah, yeah.
And I can remember, like, before, okay, and we both come from a journalistic background, as a travel writer and I as a newspaper guy. And before I started writing fiction, I would go to some of these conferences, and there'd be a fiction guy occasionally, the guy with the elbow patches and the tweedy jacket, and he'd always be like, they'd always say, okay, Mr. Great Fiction Writer, where do you get your ideas? And and the great fiction writer would always say, well, my characters tell me where the story is going to go next. And I can always remember thinking, like, yeah, do your characters tell you you're a nutbag? Because that's what you sound like right now.
I always thought that was the greatest answer ever, because you do hear
yeah.
that when you go to writers' conferences. It's always like, oh, well, my characters tell me this, and they tell me that. And
yeah.
Thinking, really? Like, that either sounds sort of so crazy, or else sort of so condescending in a weird way, that there are these voices. And then, as I've been writing, it's like, no, actually, they do kind of dictate. You know that it's all coming out of your own subconscious, but when you've created a character and the character has their own history and you want to be faithful to that, you actually can't go, and just make them do anything that you that you want to do. So that's a great point. So actually, and here's a question for character about you that I'm curious about, because both of us have things that are in common with our protagonists. I mean, career is the obvious thing,
right.
But does that make it more or less difficult for you to write a character that has a job in common with you, that
right.
has some history in common with you?
I've found it makes it easier, and maybe just because I'm lazy, that's what I decided to do. But there are, I find there are conveniences. And I think probably Carter Ross, my protagonist, has more in common with me than Lily does with you. I mean, because I also made him physically, well, let me see, about 6'1", about 185 pounds, brown hair, blue eyes, pleated khaki pants. I'm always required to point out. So, yeah.
The mugshot fits.
Yeah, here I am. But it always. I always felt like it kind of allowed me to write with more authority, and especially having lived with, I was a reporter in Newark, New Jersey, so I went to all the same places that Carter goes, whether it's a tenement or a housing project or a strip club. Yeah, I went to strip clubs. The first time my mom read a draft of Faces of the Gone, and here's Carter Ross going into, I think he goes to a strip club in chapter 2, chapter 3, and my mom reading the first, she's like, well, Bradley, you haven't actually been to all these places, have you? It's like, oh, no, Mother, not at all. But of course I have. But, I know, because I have a character who's similar to me, I know how people react to me in those places. When you're walking through the worst parts of Newark, New Jersey, and, there's not a white face who's not a social worker for 3 miles square around the place, and how people look at me when they see a white guy dressed roughly like me walking through. You can almost hear the record scratching, and so, for me, being able to put that kind of stuff in Carter is nice. Is easy. But for you, this is the funny thing. So if you read Hilary's character, right, orphaned and drug abuse, and all of her parents have died in these horrible ways, and all this family tragedy, you would think that oh my God, Hilary, I'm so sorry. Can I offer you a handkerchief? I mean, you must have led this tragic life, and you haven't.
Well, this was actually one of the things after I got to the end of the. That's horrible.
Surprise yourself.
It was terrible. When I wrote The Damage Done, I got to the end of the book, and I felt that it was the first time that something in my brain twigged, and I thought, what if people think that Lily's family is like my family? What if, she actually had a close relationship with her father, but her father died when she was 13, and then her mother later went on to kill herself when Lily was 18, and she had a really troubled relationship with her mother. And I felt paranoid.
Oh, I mean, Lily's mother is horrible. I feel bad for you. I mean, Lily's mother is who's the actress whose mom beat her with a hanger?
Well, Joan Crawford did that with her adopted.
Lily's mom makes Joan Crawford look like Mother of the Year or something like that. I mean,
I ended up dedicating The Damage Done to my mother because I was so paranoid that people were going to look at this and think, oh, poor child, your life is like that. And Lily has a really messed up romantic life as well, which, I mean, it's funny because to some extent we have the career in common, and there are things that I sort of gave to Lily that I'm interested in. So, for instance, she's obsessed with old movies, and that's something that I got kind of early on from my grandmother. My grandmother was a big Barbara Stanwyck fan, so if you've ever watched Barbara Stanwyck movies, she was in a lot of really kind of great noir films like Double Indemnity, most famously, but The Strange Love of Martha Ivers and Babyface, all these really twisted things. And my grandmother, who used to babysit me, was showing me these movies at a young age and exposing me to these things.
That explains everything. Okay.
So the dark twistedness in there. And, I think of Lily, I mean, a bit like being a dame like my grandmother was. She's a tough character, and she's tougher than she realizes. She, in The Damage Done, I think she sort of touches the surface of that. She's always been the good girl, and her sister's always been the bad girl, and Lily sort of becomes more and more the bad girl through that book, and much more so in the next one to fall. And it's funny because on the one hand, I feel like she's a more refined character than I am. I grew up with 2 brothers. I was a total tomboy. I started studying martial arts when I was 8 years old, and I have a huge passion for that. I studied karate and Krav Maga. And I always have to remember, if Lily gets into trouble, her instinct is not to punch people, which is kind of more like how I would feel about things. But then at the same time, there's a certain vulnerability to her that, you know, when I travel, it's how I feel. She suffers from altitude sickness in this book, and that kind of tortures her. And when I went to Peru, I suffered from that. And there's this strange kind of remoteness when you're a travel writer. You spend a lot of time on your own on the road. And in my case, I had my imaginary friends along. In Lily's case, her life has really been a lot like that, where she's been alone a lot, and the movies that she watches, the characters that fill her head that way, that's almost like family to her. And that probably sounds really sad to hear that described, but I do understand from spending so much time on the road on my own that what it's like to do that, and I've done that myself. So yeah, there are these weird points of intersection, but I'll just say my personal life is so boring and so not dramatic. My parents are, they're two of my biggest fans, and they literally, I always thought of them as very shy, kind of quiet people, and they actually go out on the street accosting strangers saying, "Did you know our daughter's a writer?" And they start pushing books and bookmarks on them, and yeah, very different from Lily's family.